imagine this. You've just landed a brand deal and you're really excited about it. You get an email notification and you see that the client has sent over the contract for you to review. You open the document and suddenly you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is another creator's contract. They're contracted for the same campaign as you. They have the same number of followers as you, same engagement rate, same everything. The difference is this creator is getting paid 10x what you're getting paid for the same campaign. How is this possible? Well, the other creator is a better negotiator and you need to up your game. Today, we're talking all about the brand deal negotiation secrets that every creator should learn. Welcome to Small Steps, Big Moves, the podcast about the business of influence and content creation. My name is Carmen Sognonvi and I've been creating content primarily in the luxury family travel space since 2016. And even as a small and then a mid-sized creator, I've actually been able to generate 6 figures in income from paid travel and brand deals every single year since 2018. So to me, the business side of this profession is just as much fun as the creative side.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Gatto, and I'm a freelance video editor and content creator in the food and travel space. I primarily work with small businesses and other content creators, and I've been watching YouTube since before I could ride a bike. Now that I work professionally in the space, I've really enjoyed being able to take a peek behind the scenes and see how this business truly works. The focus of this episode is brand deal negotiations and all the secrets that every creator should learn. So Carmen, what are some of these must-know secrets?
One of the tips that you often hear when it comes to negotiation is the idea that you want to have the other party say a number first. And when it comes to brand deals and creators, very often creators will be told, oh, if you get an inquiry from a brand, never tell them your fee. Your first question should be, what's your budget? And I actually think this is really, really terrible advice.
It can corner you into a rate that you might be dissatisfied with, and you could be, really undercharging at the end of the day.
But another reason I think this is just not that useful of a tactic when it comes to brand deal negotiation is put yourself in the brand's shoes, right? So let's say you need a manicure. You go into a nail salon and you're like, hey, how much for just a basic manicure? And instead of telling you how much it is, the salon is like, well, what's your budget?
Yeah, and I feel like, you're going to get your nails done. Like, the service is being provided by the manicurist. So, they should be the ones to know how much this costs. So replace, manicure and person getting their nails done with creator and brand. It's like the creator should know how much this service should cost because they're the ones providing the service.
Exactly. And it shouldn't vary depending on how much money is in that person's wallet, right? It should be like the fee is the fee is the fee.
Yeah, you don't want to be just overcharging people because you assume they have money.
Exactly.
That's not kosher.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're a professional, you should already know how much you charge for a particular service, based on the parameters, the scope that the client is giving you. And you should be confident in your rate, and you should already know that you're charging at or near the top of the market. And we're going to talk later in the episode about exactly how to make sure you're doing that. But the point is you need to know your rate. And if you are kind of seeming very wishy-washy and seeming like you're going to change your rate depending on who the client is, that just comes across as very, not just unprofessional, but just untrustworthy.
Yeah. And, you shouldn't be asking about what the budget is. You should be asking about what the project is.
Yes.
Because the scope of the project is what determines your cost. And, we'll talk about how to, increase rates and things like that. But really what you need to know is how much work am I doing? And you have that rate that you've set at, be confident in it, and then ask the right questions.
Exactly.
So what is another secret?
So another secret when it comes to negotiating brand deals is never quote with the bare minimum fee you would take for a project. So let's say, the brand has laid out the scope. They want this many posts. They need this much usage, this much paid media, this much exclusivity. Just to use round numbers, let's say the bare minimum you would accept for that amount of work is $1,000. Don't quote $1,000 because you have to understand that there's always going to be a bit of back and forth with negotiation. And so always add a buffer, add on 20%, 30%. So instead of quoting $1,000, if that's your bare rock bottom price, quote $1,200 or $1,300. Just leave a little buffer so that, you can kind of go back and forth a little bit.
Yeah. And that buffer just helps you really get what you're aiming for. I think that's great advice. And, I think if you have a range of what you typically charge, just do the math and have your number set and you'll be ready to go when those emails come in.
Yeah, exactly. And, same goes the other way around, right? Sometimes a brand will come to you already with an offer in hand. rather than asking you what's your fee for the scope. They'll be like, hey, this is the scope of the project. Our budget is this. Is this good for you? In those cases, that first number that the brand is throwing out is often not their best and final offer. Like if it is their best and final offer, they'll let you know that. But you can also assume that they've added a little bit of, they've come down a little bit. They've added a little buffer to go up. So never be afraid to counter and just say, if they offer you $1,000, you can always say, hey, I think typically I would charge $1,300 for this. Do you think we can do that? And then if they're like, oh, $1,300 is a bit too high, but we can land at like $1,250, then you're set.
Yeah. And, when you get into that negotiation process, especially if this is like your first brand deal ever, I know it can be a little like nerve wracking. And I think one of the things that I like to do is kind of just make a list, honestly, for myself or for yourself, of all the things that you bring to the table. How long have you been making videos? Like, what are some of skills you have? Is there a type of audience that's unique to you? These are all things to kind of help you understand where that rate comes from, even if you already know how much you want to charge. So when you go back and you negotiate, you can feel more confident in, your emails that you're sending, especially if something turns into a conversation. You're kind of very equipped to understand yourself and your content a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that list, you don't necessarily have to send that to the client, right?
Yeah,
this can be just like internal use only.
Yeah.
Like it's just sort of for you to remind yourself, like, I am worthy. Because, negotiation, pricing, it's all very emotional. It's very psychological. Like we'd like to think that this stuff is just pure math and pure business. But no, this kind of comes down to like, sometimes it feels like they're measuring your worth as a human being, right? Because when you're a creator, when you're an influencer, you as a person are so heavily tied into your work. So sometimes it feels like this is how much you are worth as a person. So the more that you can, remind yourself that like, hey, I am worth it. I have this much experience. I've worked with these other brands. That can be a helpful tool for sure. But I think, the key is don't be afraid to counter. Don't be afraid to go back and forth. Like that is a standard part of the process. Don't feel like, hey, if you get an offer and you counter with a little bit higher, that you're being rude. It's not rude. Like this is literally just a standard part of the process. So don't feel weird about it.
Yeah, I mean, negotiation is typical in any kind of deal. You buy a house, it's not black and white. You're going back and forth. You're putting bids on. It's the same thing.
Exactly. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about what it takes to become a travel content creator, like me, I actually have a free masterclass you can take. It's called How to Make It as a Travel Influencer Without Being Young, Hot, or Rich. You'll find this masterclass useful if you want to be a travel influencer, but you don't have the time or budget to travel frequently. You want to create travel content, but you worry that you don't have a background in photography or videography. You want to grow an audience, but you don't know how to attract the right followers and keep them engaged because you don't have much experience with social media. To sign up for this free masterclass, just visit travelinfluencerclass.com.
So what is another secret?
So another secret is to keep in mind that everything is negotiable. Everything. And I think when we think about negotiation, all we're fixated on often is money, right? What's the fee? Yes, the fee is negotiable, but that fee is just the beginning. There's a lot of other things that you can negotiate.
Getting your first brand deal is exciting, like we said, but you want to remember that negotiating is normal. So it can also come across as professional and seasoned if you're able to go back and forth a few times and kind of discuss the project in the terms professionally.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't assume that you just have to take what's offered, right? It's like they offer you something and it's either a yes or no answer. Like you said, it actually may gain you a little respect if you are able to negotiate and say, oh, well, let me push back a little bit on this point, or, you need this, which actually costs a little more. So let's kind of talk about specific things that you can negotiate. So the first thing, obviously, is the actual content deliverables. So typically a brand deal will be like, hey, we need this number of Instagram reels, this many TikToks, this many static posts, this many Instagram stories. So whatever is like the scope of the actual content deliverables, that is something you can always negotiate. So rather than having one of each thing I just mentioned, if their budget is limited, you take off one or two. Another thing that you can negotiate is, of course, usage rights. Very often with brand deals, it'll come with a certain duration and a certain type of usage rights that the brand has, meaning that they have the right to use the content you create in a number of ways, whether it's organically on their social media or to use it to run as ads. That's part of the negotiation. So the duration and the type of usage rights, that's also something you can negotiate. Paid media rights is another thing. Does the brand have the right to boost your content? If so, for how long? Again, that is something you can negotiate. If they want 1 month, but their budget doesn't really allow for that, you can negotiate down to just 2 weeks. And then the big one also, I think, would be exclusivity. And this is the one where I think creators have to be the most careful with how they price this, because exclusivity basically means you are barred from taking on a brand deal with any of that brand's competitors. So it's essentially the brand is buying your silence, so to speak. And this is the only piece that truly can cost you money as a creator. Like the rest of the stuff, you're sort of just giving the brand more permission to do stuff with or giving them more content. But with exclusivity, there's the potential that you have to turn away business that's coming in. And so that is definitely something you should negotiate very carefully. And again, duration is a big thing. So it's like, do they want 3 months? Do they want a year of exclusivity? Do they just want 3 days before and after the post? And then also, how do they categorize their competitors? Is it just like, hey, we're a gummy bear brand, so you can't work with any other gummy bears? Or is it you can't work with any other candies? Or is it we sell only in Target, so that means you can't work with Walmart or Amazon? Like, how broadly is the competitive set defined, right? Those are all things that you can negotiate.
Yeah, so negotiate.
Exactly.
Can you kind of help me understand what this looks like? Like, what if a brand comes to you, says like, hey, we can't do that for, like you said, 2,000. What about 1,500? Do you just accept it because that's still like a pretty good offer to you? Or, can you come back and be like, well, the terms are net 60. Can we do net 45? Mm-hmm. What does something like that kind of look like?
Yeah. So actually, before I talk about the specific example, you mentioned payment terms. That's another thing you can negotiate, right? Very typically, brands, industry standard is like net 30, meaning you get paid 30 days after you complete all the work, everything's published, analytics are submitted. But sometimes brands will come and say, hey, our payment terms are net 60, or God forbid, net 90, which don't say yes to that. So you can always, negotiate the payment terms, be like, hey, if I'm going to come down on fee, you need to pay me a little faster because we need to give and take. Another thing that you can negotiate, which I think creators often don't think about, is the timeline. So very often, if a brand deal comes along and they're like, hey, we need the content by 2 days from now, obviously you should charge a rush fee for that. So that's one thing. But conversely, if it's sort of the opposite, where it's a longer timeline, like it's not a huge rush project, if the brand is reducing the fee, sometimes you can also negotiate for like, hey, instead of turning content around in a week or 2 weeks, can I have 3 weeks or 4 weeks? And that may actually just make your life easier as a creator. If you're juggling multiple brand deals with very tight deadlines, that just gives you a little bit of breathing room. So if they're like, hey, we need a reduction in your fee, that can be another sort of, ace in your pocket to be like, hey, that's fine, but in return, I'm going to need a little bit of a longer timeline. And that's just going to help your mental health.
So you're kind of saying if a brand is coming back with less than what you quoted, you can kind of take some things away or kind of readjust some of those payment terms and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of the point of negotiation, right? Like if they've established the scope and you said, okay, my fee for this is, again, to use round numbers, $2,000. And the brand is like, well, we only have $1,000 to spend on this campaign. What you don't want to do is say, okay, I'll take 1,000, and you've just like cut your fee in half. Ideally, what you want to do is say, okay, well, let's tweak some of these specifics of the scope. So for example, instead of one Instagram reel and Instagram stories, we can take away the Instagram stories. That's one way to kind of cut down on scope. Or if it's, they're asking for 30 days of usage and 30 days of paid media rights, you can cut that down and say, okay, well, instead of 30 days, I can give you 14 days since your budget is so limited. Same with exclusivity, right? Instead of 2 months of exclusivity, maybe you can give a week since it is a low paid project. And if you have to turn away another deal, potentially that deal is going to be worth more than this deal. So you need to be compensated for that. Or you want to reduce the risk of that happening. So the shorter the exclusivity window, the less likely you have to turn away business. By the way, if you're finding this video useful, please do us a favor and hit the like button. It really does help us reach more creators just like you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss our next video.
So what's another secret?
Okay, another secret is actually one of our small steps. So the name of this podcast is Small Steps, Big Moves. And the reason that I named it that is because I found in, over a decade of being an entrepreneur, very often it's the small details that really make the biggest difference to a business. And this is one example of them. So anytime you submit a quote, my small step of something you should do is you should always never submit a number without every single thing laid out. So exactly what content deliverables are included, usage, paid, exclusivity, and also how long this fee is valid for. And we'll circle back to why that's important. So even if, and you may think like, oh, okay, well, I do that anyway. But even if something is not included, make sure you say that. So if there's no exclusivity, you have to have a section that says no exclusivity rights are included here. And even if, let's say you're going back and forth with a brand and first you submit, your fee and then they counter and say, oh, can you do this? And you're like, okay, I'll agree to this and we'll reduce these deliverables. Anytime you say a number, again, you want to spell out everything all in one paragraph, all in one bullet point, or not one bullet point, but a list of bullet points. And yeah, that's going to save you so much headache.
Yeah. So I understand the organization, but what's the real reason for this? Is that, necessary? It can feel tedious.
Yeah, it may feel like a little bit like you're being super anal about it, which you are. But the reason that this is so helpful is because after you guys kind of do the negotiation over email, then the next step is they send you over the contract to review. Most of the time, the brand is the one sending the contract. If it's a really small business, you might create the contract yourself, but most of the time it's going to be, the brand sending it over. They will send it over usually as a Word document so that you can kind of review it, make any changes. And let me tell you, I would say 7 out of 10 times, there will be stuff slipped into that contract that was not agreed to. Now, this is not always maliciousness, right? It's not always out of malice. Very often you'll find, especially with these PR agencies, that they're just like doing a lot of copying and pasting. So they're taking one contract with one influencer and then like slapping your name on it. And sometimes they just forget to update some terms. And, oftentimes I'll have like other influencers' names on the contract. Like it gets sloppy, y'all. Like don't expect that you're dealing with these billion-dollar brands and things don't get messy, because they do. But what you'll find is very often, let's say you made it clear that, hey, there's no exclusivity included in this fee. And then you read the contract and suddenly it's like, oh, you can't work with any competitors for 6 months. And so at that point, what would be really difficult is if all of these negotiations were spread out over like 20 different emails in a thread. It's kind of hard for you to say, hey, as we had talked about, there's no exclusivity included. If you have everything in one go, you forward that one single email where you quoted your fee and it said no exclusivity is included in this. You just forward that one email and you say, hey, as per my email from December 5th, you'll remember that there's no exclusivity included, so let's make sure we remove this from the contract. That's going to make your life so much easier, like I said, than having this long, sprawling conversation spread out over 20, 30 emails, where then you and the client have to kind of go through and be like, oh, where did we say this? Did we actually agree to this? Because remember, like, this is probably not the only brand deal you're juggling. You're not the only influencer that this agency is like negotiating with, right? So it can be difficult to keep track of things. So that's why it's really important.
So you're saying you literally take the contract and like redline it and like make your revisions and then send it back?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a standard part of the negotiation process. So just like we talked about, countering and going back and forth on fee, that is a standard part. Like, don't feel weird about pushing back. Also, a very standard and expected part is that there's a reason that you usually get the contract as a Word document, not a PDF at first, because they expect you to look through it. If you have a lawyer, have them look through it. I think most creators we kind of wing it, to be honest. Like once you've read a few contracts, you kind of know what are the main clauses to look for. But obviously, if it's like a really big one, sure, get a lawyer to review it. But it's expected that as the influencer, you are going to read through everything, make sure that you're okay with how everything is phrased, and it's your job to catch any mistakes that are made. And there will be things slipped in there, so you have to read it carefully.
So why else is it useful to have all of that information in one place or one email?
Yeah, so, we talked about it's useful for the redlining process when you're reviewing the contract, making sure that everything in the contract is what was agreed upon over email. The other reason that is really helpful for you to have that, one place quote where it's like, hey, this is the quote, this is everything that isn't included, is for your own tracking. Because, as you're a little further along in this career, hopefully you're going to be doing multiple brand deals at the same time. And very often what will happen is you will get an inquiry from a competitor or a quasi-competitor, and you're going to have to think back and be like, oh, am I allowed to take on this other deal? Or sometimes the exclusivity requirements can be simple things like the brand doesn't want you to post even organic content for 24 hours before or after, because they kind of want their sponsor post to really land well. So you need to keep in mind a lot of those little things. And if for yourself to try and remember, hey, can I take on this deal? Hey, am I allowed to post right now? It's like 12 hours after the sponsor post went up. For you to have to comb through like hundreds of emails to find that information scattered through a thread, that's going to drive you crazy. So again, for your own purposes, just having it all in one place is going to be really, really helpful.
And, we're kind of talking about negotiation, how all that back and forth is typical and can honestly take a while. So what happens if, you've set a rate, you've gone through it, but the brand's been thinking about it for a while, and then all of a sudden you have a video that goes viral and your reach is much bigger, which I think would change your rates, right?
Yep. That's exactly why it's so important to put an expiration date anytime you quote for a project. I touched on that very briefly earlier, but this does happen, right? Like you said, sometimes brand deal negotiations drag on. Sometimes clients just completely ghost you, and then they pop up 9 months later, and a lot can happen in 9 months. It's social media. Like you said, you can suddenly go viral, or maybe you got showcased on some piece of mainstream media, and that brought you a bunch of new followers. Anything can happen. And so that rate is not forever. So you need to say how long that rate is good for. So every creator will do this differently. A lot of creators just don't do this at all. Same with talent management agencies. So if you're a talent management agency and you're not doing this, there's something to add right away. But I personally will only do 30 days out. So in other words, if I quote you for a campaign, that fee is good for the next 30 days. If these things drag on past 30 days, then that rate may go up. It's not guaranteed. So that's really how you protect yourself against those situations. Because you might go from 10,000 followers to 2 million followers in 6 months. Then that brand circles back to you and you're like, well, that rate isn't valid anymore, but there was nothing in the way you submitted it to indicate that there was an expiration date.
Do you have language you would suggest putting in emails? Because I feel like since not everyone does this, you don't want to come off, as too aggressive, especially if you're just starting out. Do you write valid until or expires at?
Yeah, exactly. It's just another bullet point for me. So it's, valid until this date. And then also actually one thing I forgot to say is you should also put in your payment terms in the quote, because very often the brand will not say upfront what their payment terms are. So you should establish right from the get-go what they are. So for example, if you require 50% down, which you should always push for that, you're not always going to get it, but at least that should be your first push. So for me, standard, if it's a fairly small project, is 50% down and we bill net 30. And the first 50% is due upon contract signing. So I'll put that, again, anytime I quote the fee, that those payment terms will be in there. Then that also gives them something to react to, right? Where if they're like, oh, well, we can't do net 30, but we can do net 45, no problem. But again, then if you get that contract and they're like, oh, you're not going to get paid anything until the whole thing is done and it's net 90, then again, you can go back and say, hey, my December 5th email, I let you know that these are my payment terms, so we're going to have to change that language.
So what is another secret?
So another secret when it comes to brand deal negotiation is that nobody is going to give you a raise in this industry other than yourself. So in other words, you can't sit around and wait until a brand says, hey, I know last time we paid you this much, but this year we think you're really good, so we're going to bump it up to this rate. You have to be the one that initiates that. You have to be the one that demands that, because no one is ever going to offer to pay you more. Like, that's just not how business works. And so really, as the creator, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're consistently increasing your rates to the point where you feel pretty comfortable that you're charging at or near the top of the market for the sort of like type of creator you are.
Yeah, and demand for production is high. And so, you can't trust that companies are going to adjust their offerings for the market rate. So you just want to keep raising until you feel like you've hit that ceiling or you're at a rate that you're very comfortable with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, a lot of freelancers and creators have this mentality that like, oh, well, raising rates is an annual thing where it's like, hey, my 2023 rate was this, but now it's 2024, so now I have to increase it to this. So it shouldn't be an annual thing. And actually the method that I sort of teach creators that I mentor is to do constant incremental raises. Because very often you'll hear from people who are, self-employed or freelancers again, who are like, oh, I had to like increase my rates a lot this year, but now I'm really nervous about telling my clients. Just don't ever put yourself in that position. And if you do incremental rates all the time, you're never going to be in that position.
So, you were kind of saying how freelancers like to raise their rates once a year. Are you saying you don't agree with that? I know in this profession, it's like a little bit different, but we're all kind of working for ourselves in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, look, you could do what you want, right? But I would say that it feels less scary to do these incremental raises, because essentially, like, you're not just, forgive my French, you're not just pulling a number out of your ass, right? Where it's like, if you've already gotten hired at $1,000, when you ask for $1,200, it's not that big of a leap. It's not that big of a stretch. If you go from getting paid $1,000 and then project number 2, you're like, now my rate is $10,000. That's a bit of a stretch. If you get it, cool, that's great. But I think the idea is that it helps you raise your rates while feeling confident that, hey, there's already people paying this rate. And I think, when it comes to pricing, that sort of emotional aspect is so important, because, one of the reasons that creators often get very down on themselves when it comes to pricing is there will be some agencies that will deliberately gaslight you, right? And kind of make you feel like you think you're worth this rate. Like, you're not worth it because I just worked with this other creator that has more followers than you, and I only paid them this. Now, if you've never gotten that rate before that you're asking for, that might really hurt you, and you might second guess yourself and be like, oh, well, yeah, maybe I'm not worthy. Maybe I'm stretching too far. But if you're like, well, I just got paid basically that rate by this other brand, I guess you just can't afford me. It's a different mentality. So I think it helps you build that confidence. And then it also feels like the increases are based on reality. Like, you're not just pulling a number out of the air and doing some wishful thinking. And the other thing is, like, you're not just waiting around hoping that the other brand, like the other party, slips up and says a number that's bigger than what you had in mind, which is kind of like the idea behind what we talked about first, which is the whole what's your budget thing. Like, that's the idea, right? Where it's like, if you think your rate is 1,000, but this brand was willing to pay you 10,000, like, you want to kind of discover that. It's like, you should never be in a position where you need to discover that. You should already be charging at the top of your market and know that and be confident in that rate. You don't have to rely on the other party to just like slip up and reveal that you could be getting more in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice. I think it's awesome to, figure out and learn how to maximize your income and negotiate your way to becoming a full-time creator.
Doing brand deals can be extremely lucrative, but it's also easy to blow it and jeopardize your future opportunities. And there's one critical mistake in particular that you need to avoid. So check out this video where I tell you what it is and why getting it wrong can be so, so terrible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over there.